This talk is mostly about the most recent project I've worked on, that book that's going around and the flies in front of you. But I want to start it by mentioning the very first project I worked on, which means going all the way back in time to 1995, when I got a job at Lancaster University on something called the British National Corpus Tag Enhancement Project. And this... This is my staff photo. I'm age 23 there, believe it or not. And that rather severe amount of hair gel was the height of fashion for 1995. You'll have to take my word for that. My dad, I remember phoning my dad and saying, I've got a job finally. And he was really pleased for me. And he said, what is it? And I said, I'm on a tag enhancement project. And he said, what is it? And I said, it's this big collection of millions of words of bits of text from newspapers and books and magazines. And the computer program has gone through it all and marked up all of the nouns and verbs and adjectives, etc., and all the words. But it's still in the early days, and it makes mistakes. It's about 95% accurate. So my job is to go through it and check when it's made a mistake and correct it by hand, and then also sort of work out why it got it wrong and suggest rules to make it better. And in those days, we worked with reams of printer paper. We had these massive stacks. I don't know if you remember those dot matrix printers that had those little dots by the side. Reams of those, which looked a bit like the output shown here. And I've highlighted that word turns. If any of you are familiar with the output of clause, you'll see that's been tagged as a verb, and it should be a noun. And that was the kind of thing I had to do for about 2 years. That was my life, just going through those kind of things. So I explained all that to my dad, and he looked at me and he said, well, why would anybody want to do any of that? How is that going to make the world a better place? And I said, well, and then I didn't really have an answer to that, really. And that question of why anyone would want to do corpus linguistics, I think, was something which bugged me for about 3 or 4 years at the start of my career. And one I've been trying to answer ever since. And it wasn't really until a few years after that when I started reading work by people at Birmingham, by John Sinclair, and then people who had influenced, like Michael Stubbs and Susan Hunston, that I started to see the potential for corpus linguistics to have an impact on the world outside academia. And as a result, quite a lot of my early corpus research was based upon media representation of various identity groups, LGBT people, immigrants and Muslims. In the past decade or so, academics have been increasingly asked to carry out and evidence the impact of their research. 5 years ago was the first time that universities had to provide an impact statement for the REF, or the Research Excellence Framework. It's a system for assessing research quality across higher education. And the next REF in 2021 also asks departments to provide an impact statement. I'm sure some of you are involved in that right now. On one level, pressure to have impact is a bit of a hassle because it's extra work, but I can also see the point of it. It's good for research to make a difference beyond academia. And I think there's also a kind of sense of extra achievement that you can get if you feel you actually have had impact. So with the result of the research on Islam I've done, I've been to Parliament a few times. I've presented my work there to MPs. We've had our findings used as part of the Levinson inquiry a few years ago into news practices. And it's still going on. Last month we were mentioned in a Parliament debate on Islamophobia, and the research got mentioned by one of the MPs there. We've also gone into mosques and we've talked about our findings to different communities around the country. We've advised people on the kinds of negative patterns in the press they should be looking for, and also what to do if they find them, how to complain, how to get things changed as well. We've also advised the Home Office on how to identify extremist texts, and with Lawrence Anthony we created a piece of software for the Home Office which helps to speed up that process which they're using. So those are the kind of things now that when I talk to my dad on the phone, I can say I'm doing these things. I can say I've been to Parliament and we've given this piece of software to the Home Office, and he kind of goes, okay, that's okay. But I have to admit that the impact side of research is actually more challenging to me than the actual sitting down and doing the research itself. We don't really get proper training for it, and it can require skill sets that don't really come naturally, I think, to maybe all of us. I think quite a lot of academics are kind of happiest at our computers in our offices, kind of beavering away, or in our libraries. Sometimes impact feels a bit like I'm playing a giant board game where no one's really explained the rules to me. And an issue is it has to go beyond dissemination. It's not just about publishing something. It's not even about, say, a newspaper publishing a research. It's about getting people to change their views or to change their behavior. And that's hard. And also, it's quite hard to evidence it as well when you're trying to write these impact statements. Another aspect of the challenge of impact is that we need to carve out a niche for ourselves in an increasingly crowded field. There's a lot of large organizations and businesses collecting language data for various reasons at the moment, and they want to make sense of that data, but they don't always know what to do with it, where to start, and who to ask. And I think often they're quite attracted by approaches which promise them a great deal. And I think cases where computer software will replace human expertise. So they don't really require people to have lots of knowledge of computer programming or statistics or linguistics or discourse analysis. Instead, what they want is a piece of software. They can put their data into the software very easily and then wait a few seconds and out will pop the results. And that will all be condensed into a couple of nice infographics with colors. But corpus linguistics doesn't really work like that, though. And the research I'm going to be talking about today involves looking at a large corpus of patient feedback about the National Health Service. So this is data which the NHS approached us and asked us to help them to analyse it. The NHS is a massive, quite baroque and complicated institution with lots of different departments which are tasked for analysing feedback. And we interact with several managers of the different departments relating to feedback. In our first meeting, we tried to explain our approach and what corpus linguistics was and what it could and couldn't do and what our tools looked like. And we'd say that we'd use software as a kind of initial way into the data to tell us what's interesting or salient or representative, but then we'd have to go into the data ourselves and read hundreds of lines of concordance data or actually go into the text and explore them and do a linguistic analysis of them. And then we'd have to kind of try and interpret that and explain why it's happening. And at one point I was kind of halfway through this and one of the managers in charge kind of stopped me and said, well, we've invested in this piece of software that's tens of thousands of pounds and that's going to do all that for us, so we don't need you. And that was the last time I actually saw him. Hopefully it's working. But that's not our approach. And I couldn't really get through to him that our approach, I hope, is better than the software. And I'll try to explain in the course of this talk why it is. I think another issue is that corpus linguistics doesn't, for me anyway, sound particularly exciting or even clear as a kind of term or a brand. When I think of things like, say, sentiment analysis or topic modeling or big data or deep learning, even if we don't know what those things mean, we can have a good stab at them and they sound impressive. The thing about corpus linguistics is it sounds a bit like a cryptic crossword puzzle clue. You have to know Latin. You have to know that corpus is Latin for body and that it's not an actual body, but it's a metaphorical body of text. And when you explain that every time to a new group of people, you can see them sort of glazing over a little bit and you've kind of lost their interest half the time. Now, I think we were one of the first people to do this, the corpus linguists, and we were in a field where computers were still new or not existent in most cases, and we had to find a way of making the field sound good and sound impressive. And I think it helped to give the field credibility back in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And we all know what it means in this room. But I think there's a bit of a barrier to getting us outside universities. And I think we have a bit of a branding problem with the term itself compared to some of the other terms which I think sound a bit sexier than ours. So if I could go back in time, I would try to change it. I'd try to get those original pioneers to use something like computer-assisted language analysis or something. But obviously that boat has gone and we have to make do with what we have. And I think it's a shame, though, that we sometimes do lose out to sort of more flashier sounding ways and products because we have a great deal to offer. Not only can we do a lot of the descriptive analysis of patterns and trends in a data set, but we can do it in a more nuanced, accurate way compared to maybe some of the other computational approaches. And we can go further. We can get insights into the underlying reasons for the patterns. In other words, if you just rely on the computer software, I think it can take you so far, but I don't think it can take you far enough. And I was chatting to Galinda Mountainer a couple of months ago about this, and she gave a really nice example of how she views corpus linguistics. She says it's really, really good at the middle bit of the analysis, but it's not so good at the stuff at the start, and it's not so good at the stuff at the end. And I think that's really, for me, where the difference is between us and other approaches. So I'm going to talk about how we can use computational tools to help us, but also to indicate how it's only with close human engagement, the stuff at the start and the end, and in the middle as well, that we can really produce insightful findings. So this is the most recent impact-based project that I've been involved in. As I said, it involved working with NHS England to help them find ways to analyse and make sense of patient feedback data. I got a grant to do this by ESRC to look at 18 months' worth of patient feedback, which had been placed on NHS England's website, about 29 million words in total. And so we scraped the data from the website, we tagged it using that tagger, and we then put it on Lancaster's CQP web system. Andrew Hardy did all of that. The research came out of the book, which is going round with Routledge, which I co-authored with Gavin Brooks and Craig Evans. And it was also reported recently, last month, in a few newspaper outlets like the Mail, Metro, and The Independent. So we were mainly working with a department called the Patients and Information Directorate in NHS England. And they gave us 12 questions that they'd like us to answer. And I had one researcher, Gavin Brooks, and we had 6 months to do this, which worked out at two weeks per question, which wasn't really a lot. And as with many projects, I think, it's often not till the grant has ended and it's kind of finished that you actually start thinking about it, and then you start to make progress in your own time. And we did a lot of this after the grant had finished in our own time. Another issue, I think, with those questions is that they weren't really the ones that we would have asked ourselves. And also, they weren't really very languagey questions. Or if they did talk about language, it was sort of indirect. So we had questions like, what are the key drivers of positive and negative feedback? Or what was the impact on the person who posted the feedback? Or how many times did somebody mention in their feedback that they'd already complained about that thing once before? And perhaps as a result of those questions not really being directly language-based, we found that some of our initial corpus techniques that we used were not really as helpful as we expected that they would be. They were a bit taking us down the wrong path. So that first question, what are the key drivers of positive and negative feedback? We thought we'd look at different types of feedback, good feedback and bad feedback, and then we'd see what words collocated with the good words and the bad words. But it became apparent that when we were using techniques like log ratio or even log likelihood, it was giving us too infrequent stuff. It was giving us quite rare words and not really covering the whole corpus data. So we switched to a more frequency-based measure of collocation, where we just counted up the number of times something occurred with a word instead. This table here shows us the most frequent good and bad evaluative words in the corpus. I'm only looking at the top 10 here because it's a kind of case of diminishing returns. The frequencies start to kind of taper off quite noticeably when you get down to 10. So we felt that if we just looked at the first 10 good and bad words, we were covering an awful lot of the evaluation in the corpus anyway. We do have to take into account the potential for negation. Somebody might write, that doctor isn't too bad really, especially if they're British. But we did an analysis to look at negation, and we found it's actually quite rare in this corpus. It only occurs less than 1% of the time, and it tends to cancel itself out on either side. So we thought that's not so much of a problem, we'll just leave the negation in. The words in the table are all adjectives, which makes sense, but as we were doing the analysis, we kept coming across cases like this. This surgery is a joke. And that word joke occurred 3,402 times in the corpus, and it was almost always, 99.9%, used in a negative way. It wasn't an adjective, though, and we told CQP Web just to show us the adjectives to start with. And it wasn't until we were about 80% of the way through the research that we actually realised that joke was actually quite a common way of doing evaluations. So we had to go back and change everything. So I'll put joke in there and then redo everything. So imagine I've just done that. That's the first small but important example I want to make, though. We assumed evaluation is adjectives, and we used grammatical tagging of the corpus to get the adjectives as a kind of shortcut. But evaluation, even frequent evaluation, isn't always adjectives. And it was only when we started to engage with the data and realize how people were using language in this context that we realized this. So then we started looking at the words which collocated with these words to get an idea of what themes or concepts people were evaluating the most. So we had a list of about 20 of these, the top 20, and we started to categorize them. So these are the words on this side here which collocate, and we've kind of categorized them into themes. We initially thought about using automatic tagging to do the categorization of themes, and we had access to W matrix, which is a very good grammatical and semantic tagger. But when we started using W matrix, it wasn't really that helpful in terms of getting us themes. So a word like atmosphere, for example, in W matrix would be tagged as a geographical term, and that wasn't really what we were kind of wanting out of this. And similar things like the word management got tagged as a power word, and waiting and time got tagged as time words. And we didn't really feel that those categories were accurately capturing what was happening when people were talking using evaluation in the data. So we started doing concordance analyses of these words ourselves, and then out of that we kind of started to build a kind of a bottom-up categorization system there. So we've got words like system and appointment and management and waiting, which often involve getting access to NHS services and seem to be to do with the underlying system. So we have a category called system there. Then we've got words like attitude, atmosphere and manners, and these seem to relate to how nice members of staff were to patients. So we have this interpersonal category. And then we have another set of words, communication, attention, listener, and advice, and that seems more to do with how helpful and informative the message was, as opposed to how nice the person was who was saying it. So we had a second category there. And this was a distinction that the NHS really liked, and they said they hadn't really thought of it in that way themselves. So we thought, yes, we've told them something they don't know, great. And then the fourth category at the top, treatment. These are more general sounding words which are about the business of making people well. So they refer to technical aspects. Did the treatment make you feel any better? Did the doctor give you the right medicine? Did you experience unnecessary pain? Things like that. So we've got 4 themes, and we've got some words which index each theme. So far, so good. And then what we do is we calculate the number of positive and negative adjectives, or the word joke, relating to those words, and then we count them up and we see the proportions of positive and negative for each theme, and we do that as a bar chart or an infographic, and here it is. So that's nice and simple, and it tells a story, I think, as well. So we've got treatment. Treatment seems to come off quite well. The blue words, the blue bits of the bar are the positive adjectives, and the red ones the negative ones. So for treatment, the proportion of positive ones is much higher than the red. 87% blue there, or positive. Communication also does quite well. 77% of the time it's blue. Interpersonal and system organisation, not so good there though. We've got 44% and 41%. And the kind of narrative we thought we could create out of this is about this idea that the NHS is under pressure in recent years, particularly due to cuts and austerity in the government. And as a result of that, there are longer waiting times, fewer appointments, and staff have to focus more on the basic aspects of their jobs, getting things done, making people well. So as a result of that, they're focusing on the message itself, not the way that the message is done, and maybe they're increasingly stressed and rushing, so they don't have that time to maybe do the more nuanced interpersonal stuff, like remembering your name, or smiling at you, or listening to you talk a long time. So that's why maybe interpersonal is down, and maybe that's why system is down, because people are having to wait longer to see people as well. And that was just our hypothesis, and we decided to explore this in more detail to go deeper. And one of the advantages, I think, of our approach is that you can go beyond the questions about what the data looks like to look at why the data looks like that. So we started looking at concordance lines of these instances of evaluation, and we looked at 100 cases of the positive and 100 cases of the negative for each of the 4 bars there, so 800 concordance lines in total. And then we started categorizing the reasons why people said that the treatment was good or the interpersonal was bad. Sometimes it wasn't always clear, but usually it was. People usually elaborated, sometimes in great detail, about why they'd liked or didn't like something. So here's a pie chart. This is telling us what's going on when someone says that the interpersonal skills aren't working. So these are phrases like bad attitude or terrible manners. And you can see there that 41% of the cases refer to somebody as being rude, and then we've got some sort of related behaviours like being lazy or apathetic, not listening, being abrupt, not smiling, not answering the phone. So far, so good. Here's another pie chart. This one's to do with when treatment is evaluated positively. So this is when people say things like they had excellent care or they had great treatment. And we've got things mentioned like technical competence, 12%. Efficiency at the job, staff being hardworking, the premises being clean. Together that comes to about 30% of this pie. But then it goes wrong. We have a problem. 42% of the cases, treatment is evaluated positively because of the good interpersonal skills of the staff. 10% refer to good communication and 12% refer to appointments. So in 2% of the cases, the treatment isn't actually referring to treatment, but it's referring to one of those other categories of my themes. And it was only really by going through these expanded concordance lines that we were able to kind of figure this out. So here's a couple of examples. So we've got terrible treatment there. And this person is saying that the nurse was rude, didn't explain the treatment, and then made comments about her body. So these are kind of more interpersonal things than the treatment itself. With poor care, in the next example, the person is saying getting through on the phone is difficult, there's a long queue for reception, and the doctor is rude. So again, these are system and interpersonal issues. So going back to this table, it seems that our initial way of categorizing wasn't really capturing the things that people were meaning when they used words like care and treatment. So let's get rid of care and treatment from the table. And that was just the start, though. When we started looking at it in more detail, quite a few of the other words kind of fell down as well. So the word advice, I've categorized it as communication. It often now refers to the interpersonal skills of the staff. People not being able to get advice because they can't get through on the phone, things like that. So sometimes it was a system word, sometimes it was an interpersonal word. So let's get rid of that one. Another one was attention. That's a communication word, but again, that's referring to interpersonal skills usually. People are saying, this person was rude, they didn't pay me enough attention. So it's more about kind of social skills. So we'll get rid of that one. And then listener, again, I've put it as communication there, but often it's about a doctor being a good listener and about his interpersonal skills. So that was in the wrong category as well. At least though that bottom row seems to be reflecting what's going on for that category. But when we started to look at that in more detail, there was another problem. So take the word attitude. Now, attitude's a funny word. Unlike many of the other words in the table, attitude tends to attract evaluation. It tends to be negative. 86% of the time it's used, it tends to be used in a kind of negative context when there is evaluation around it. And the negative evaluation is so strong, it results in what Sinclair calls a semantic positi. So Sinclair's noted that many of the words and phrases that we use tend to have a tendency to occur in a certain semantic environment. In 1991, he noted famously that the word happen tended to be associated with negative things like accident. And so when we encounter the word happen, we're primed to expect or interpret what comes next as negative. And something similar seems to be going on with attitude. It also has this kind of prosody. So even when it doesn't occur with a negative or positive evaluation word, it still maintains this kind of negative priming. So look, these are an example. There's no negative or positive evaluations in here, but if you look at some of these lines, they're kind of giving off a kind of a negative force. Look at line 4. The doctor called me and immediately had an attitude with me. And I think we all know what that means when you say she gave me attitude. You know that it's not a good thing. So we could argue that we've got attitude in the right category. It is an interpersonal word, but the fact it's got this strongly evaluative sense on its own could actually mean that it's also an evaluative word. And it shouldn't even be in this table. It should be in that other table of the top 10 evaluative words, along with joke and good and bad. Of course, we could say the doctor's awful. We could say the doctor's a joke. Or we could say the doctor has an attitude. And in all three cases, we mean something negative about the doctor. So I'm not really sure whether that word should be in there or not. And the point I want to kind of make here is that we carried out an initial classification of two sets of words, evaluative words and then theme words. Our initial decision to use grammatical tags meant that we missed out the word joke to start with, which wasted time. Our semantic tagging didn't work. It gave us categories that were not really that helpful. So then when we did a bottom-up approach and we used our own categorization system and we did look at concordances to start with, that wasn't enough either. And once we started poking this and looking at it in more detail to try to explain our findings, the whole thing fell down. And we had to start over. We had to take each of these theme words one by one and identify what was happening to them in terms of evaluation. So this bar chart just shows the positive and evaluations for three words: care, service, and treatment. I'll point out service, that wasn't even in the table because we didn't know what to do with it. But at least now we can bring it back in and start to look at it. And you can see that most of the time these words are positive. For service, there's a bit of a dip compared to the other two. Often, again, service has a bit of a kind of evaluation of its own, a bit of a prosody where people say things like, I expected better customer service. So there's a kind of customer service discourse there, which we thought was quite interesting because the NHS isn't really a customer service like Marks and Spencer, but people often are talking about it in the data like it is, which we thought was interesting. So we have our new bar charts, and then we went into concordance lines again to try to work out what was being said when people were saying something was good care or bad care, or good service or bad service. And we came up with this table. And you can see that right at the top, when things are good, it's because it's good stuff, interpersonal skills, followed by communication, followed by appointments. And it's pretty much the same for when people are saying that these things are bad. Again, interpersonal skills, appointment availability, and long waiting times there as well. So we kind of concluded that it's really interpersonal skills which are the key driver here of both positive and negative feedback. Not only are patients using a lot of interpersonal words which have clearly obvious meanings like attitude and manner and atmosphere, but even when they're using the words that are not interpersonal, words like treatment, they're still talking about the interpersonal skills. And I think if we'd assigned words to categories in advance, we would have missed that point. And even our initial concordance examinations really missed it as well. And I don't want to kind of put you off doing categorization. I do it a lot myself, but I think it's something we need to bear in mind that it's quite a reductive form of analysis. The table that I'm showing you here is still a categorization in some way. And I think we need to ask ourselves questions, to what extent do our categorizations accurately reflect real-life users of language? Is it helpful to group similar-looking cases together? Or are we losing something important when we do so? But I think as corpus linguists, we at least have a chance to ask those questions and to answer them, to spot them when things aren't working, because we place so much importance in engaging in detail in the data and trying to find explanations for patterns. As another example of the importance of looking for explanations, I'll go back to that other type of categorization I did, which was the positive and the negative words. And I'll point out how there were, again, some consequences of this, which only gave a partial analysis. So another question which the NHS had for us were, what are the key differences in experience across different providers? So is there a difference between the way that people evaluate dentists as opposed to GPs, as opposed to pharmacists or midwives or surgeons? Do certain types of NHS practitioner attract more good or bad feedback in relationship to others? So now we have our words. This is, again, quite an easy thing to do. We can look at these words and we can look at how often does, say, a word like doctor correlate or collocate with the good words and the bad words, and again do this as a bar chart, which I'll put up there. And again, it's very similar to the one I showed you before. The blue bits are the positive words. The red ones are the negative ones. I'll give you a second or two just to look over that. Coming right to the top of the surgeons, they get 98% positive words about them as opposed to just 2% of the negative ones. So they're brilliant, apparently. Dentists, paramedics, cleaners, consultants, midwives, nurses, managers also do very well. 90% positive as opposed to the 10% negative. Coming off worse, though, are the receptionists who only get 57% positive collocates. And that's quite a big leap down from the next worst, which is doctors. I mean, they get at least 80% positive. So they're a kind of outlier in this table, and they get talked about an awful lot in the data too, compared to, say, cleaners who don't really get mentioned very much. So something quite interesting and unusual and maybe a bit worrying is happening with those receptionists and the way that people are talking about them. And that was a kind of a red flag for us, and we thought, why is the case? I think this is quite a nice summary. It's very easy to understand, but I think a potential issue with these kinds of visualizations is they can obscure the detail and maybe more interesting points. So one point about this is I've collapsed all of those top 10 evaluative and negative words into measures of just good and bad, red and blue. But maybe it's helpful to take into account that there are differences in meanings. These words are not synonyms of each other. They actually have their own different meanings. There's a difference between calling somebody, say, good and calling somebody outstanding. There is a difference there, as you'll know if you've ever given feedback on an essay or something like that. So we thought we'd look at these evaluative words and we look at them more individually to see which ones are being attracted to which members of staff. And that table there shows that. Now, I've expanded this beyond the top 10 good and bad words to include another set of words relating to social skills, words like pleasant and courteous and unprofessional and aggressive. And I think we've got some interesting differences here. GPs are more likely to be called dismissive. Nurses get called lovely and caring. To be fair to the receptionists, they do get the most good words. They get 4 of them, but they also get an awful lot of bad words as well, don't they? They get useless, rude, unfriendly, and aggressive. Further down, pharmacists are helpful. Midwives are exceptional, and surgeons are outstanding. Now, this raises a few questions. Some words are obviously better than others. You probably want to be called a word like outstanding more than, say, lovely, for example, if you had a choice of which one you could be called. Also, bearing in mind that the surgeons and dentists did really, really well overall. They got 98 and 96% positive feedback, and they get the good words like brilliant and best. Maybe we should have concluded that they all deserve raises. The NHS should just throw more money at them to keep them on and reward them. We also could have concluded that the receptionists are a problem for the NHS and they all need to be sacked or sent on training courses. The data kind of suggests that. And when I've shown this result to lots of different audiences or talked to people one-on-one, I'm always kind of amazed at how many people can't wait to tell me their awful receptionist story. Everyone seems to have what I have. I have them too. People were adamant when I showed them these tables that yes, the receptionist should be sacked. They often got quite cross, and often I would get quite defensive of the receptionist, and they would have none of it. They didn't want to know. So again, we need, I think, to go kind of into the descriptive concordance analyses to try and work out what's going on. Why do people not like receptionists, and why do they like surgeons so much? So let's look at two kind of strong collocational pairs: lovely nurses and brilliant surgeons. So nurses are 3 times as likely to be lovely as brilliant in this data set. Surgeons are twice as likely to be brilliant as lovely. So we looked at concordance lines and tried to work out what was going on when nurses were lovely and surgeons were brilliant. And here are some examples of what we found. So the lovely nurses are doing things like answering concerns, being chatty, bringing extra cups of tea, being friendly, helpful, empathic, kind. The surgeons are brilliant when they leave you with a nice tidy scar. They speak in a respectful way. They leave you with hardly any pain or discomfort. They let you make a well-informed decision. They're honest about the risks, and there's someone you can trust with their lives. And I think that's that last one, being able to trust someone with your life, which means is part of the reason why they get called brilliant, and the nurses only get called lovely. Obviously, bringing someone a cup of tea is not the same as saving your life, not killing you when you're under anaesthetic. And I think what we're seeing here is maybe something about role bias. If you are a nurse, you can do an amazing, brilliant job and be really good at your job, but you're not going to save someone's life. If you're a surgeon, that is your day-to-day job. And these people are doing their jobs, but people outside are more impressed with saving lives than bringing cups of tea and being nice. And obviously that's why they get the higher evaluations. But does that necessarily mean that they're better at their jobs and deserve more? What about receptionists? Obviously they came last in terms of the feedback, the good feedback they got. They collocated with these very negative words. Why is this the case? Does the role attract bad people, difficult people? Does it make you a bad person? I don't know. Again, let's look at some concordance lines and find out what's going on. Here are a couple of examples. The last and final time I tried to make an appointment at this health centre, the receptionist laughed in my face. Never good. My daughter is now too embarrassed to go back when she was asked personal questions about the nature of her ailment by the receptionist. I've had that happen to me as well, and it's a bit of a shock when they say, "What's wrong with you?" And especially if it's a woman and it's a man's problem, I think that can be a bit. I was very surprised and disappointed when the receptionist refused to give me an appointment or to put me through to the doctor to discuss the situation. So we looked at the 100 lines, and these are the kind of things that emerged. The rude behaviour, 58 cases, didn't answer the phone, 18 cases, wouldn't give an appointment until 18, 10 asked intrusive questions, 5 breached confidentiality, and so on. So what's going on with these receptionists? Why are they doing these bad things? Why are they being so rude and asking these questions? Maybe their behaviour is receiving a lot more scrutiny than maybe other staff members like dentists or doctors. Maybe they get held to a higher standard. And we try to think about possible reasons for them doing so badly, and the kind of expectations around what happens when we encounter a receptionist. Often we phone up, often when we're not at our best, we're feeling unwell, or we're worried about a child or a family member who's not well, or we're in a queue in a doctor's reception. And we expect them to answer the phone, to pick up, or to at least be nice to us if we're there in person. And we expect them to give us an appointment and not to kind of appear nosy and ask these questions. That's not their job. It's the doctor's job to do that. But receptionists are kind of gatekeepers. They're kind of in the way of the person we want to get to, the doctor. And often they have to tell people that they can't see a doctor right away. And this has the capacity to annoy people, especially those who are in pain or distress. Receptionists have to manage and administer a booking system which they didn't probably design themselves, but it's there on the computer in front of them. And increasingly, receptionists have to conduct what's called triage, where they have to ask you what's wrong with you, so then they can decide whether you should see somebody immediately and which doctor is a specialist, so they can give you the right person to see. I don't remember that being the case about 10 years ago, but it is increasingly the case in different surgeries. And I've noticed a switch where it happens in my doctor's surgery. And I think maybe patients haven't really realised that's what they're doing, and they can take offence at those questions and see them as the receptionist being nosy, as was the case in 10%, I think, of people the intrusive questions. We also wondered if there was more going on in terms of maybe identity. Compared to other medical staff, receptionists are not that well paid. Their average salary is about £16,000 a year, which is about half the average salary of the UK. And we wondered maybe if they're given a bit less respect and a bit less leeway compared to, say, a dismissive doctor, who at least is going to make you well. So you think, oh, well, he's not very nice, but I won't say anything because he gave me the right medicine. We also wondered if gender was a factor. 91% of receptionists in the UK are female. And we wondered if maybe there were more kind of expectations that women are the fairest sex and they're supposed to be nice and lovely and do all of those things. And we expect men to be a bit rude, but women are supposed to be the caring, nice ones of us. So when they're not being nice, we're shocked and take it personally. With that said, though, nurses get better rated than receptionists, and they tend to be women as well, and so do cleaners. So maybe it's more of a kind of intersection between gender and social class which is going on there, and the expectations of the job for receptionists. So I think there's a combination of factors to do with why we get upset with receptionists so much. And I think it's a lot to do with expectations about what receptionists should do, and also things about power relationships, social class, and also gender coming into it as well. And an overarching theme when we looked at our data set was that patient expectation played a really, really strong role in evaluation, especially when there's a kind of mismatch between patient expectation and actually what's happening. So people aren't nice about receptionists because they don't get what they want from them. They're not getting appointments. But we also found that expectations are driving other kinds of feedback as well. So take dentists. They got really, really good feedback. They got 96% positive. They get called good, great, and the best a lot. When we looked at the actual feedback about dentists, though, and we looked at keywords and why certain keywords appeared, we realized there was something quite common going on. People often wrote about how terrified of dentists they were. So there were keywords like scared and terrified and fear and phobia. They talked about having not been at the dentist for many years because of these phobias, but then when they went along, the dentist put them at ease, and the actual procedure was painless. It's interestingly, they often talked about being scared of the dentist, or scared of the chair, or scared of the injection. I think what they were really scared of was the pain, and not being able to control the pain, or predict how bad the pain was going to be, or to stop the pain. And I think it was so scary they couldn't even use the word pain, and that's why we have painless as a keyword, but not pain as a keyword there. And then they talk about how at the end of the procedure they can smile again because their teeth look nice. And we thought this was quite interesting. These people are coming along with these expectations that a dentist is going to be a terrifying, painful experience for them. And then when they actually have the experience, it's not. And I've spoken to dentists and they've said, we know that, and we make an effort. We can tell, we read the patient, we can tell when they're shaking or sweating, and we sit them down and we're lovely to them, and we put them at ease. And and these days there's not the pain that maybe there was. And I think if I think back to horror stories from my parents about terrifying dentists. You go in with a bit of a toothache and they take all your teeth out. And if you think about films where there are scary dentists in films like Little Shop of Horrors or Marathon Man or The Dentist, where these are psychotic, sadistic dentists, there's a kind of discourse of horrible dentists, I think, floating around the world. And I think we pick up on it, we absorb it, and then we are scared when we go. And it's not true, actually. Going to the dentist is okay. So if you're scared, go. That's one piece of advice I got for you. So again, it's about expectations not being met. Same for pharmacists. They get very good feedback. They get called helpful, knowledgeable. Clusters like goes the extra mile or no trouble at all are used about them. And I think what's happening here is that when people go into a pharmacy, they see a person behind a counter and they think shopkeeper. And pharmacists are not just shopkeepers. They receive an awful lot of training in all of the medicines that they have behind them, and they often give advice to you. And it is really useful, but I think people are often quite surprised at that. They weren't expecting it. So then they're really, really glad when it happens, and they feel the pharmacist has taken an interest in them and sort of given them a special personal service sometimes. But they're just doing their job, just like nurses are doing their job by bringing you cups of tea, and surgeons are doing their job by saving your life. One, again, quite concerning point we found was about mental health trusts, and they received quite bad feedback overall. 67% of it's very bad, which is an awful lot. It was they came kind of worst in all of our different categories of feedback. And the various reasons behind this, there was mention of funding and lack of funding. So people often complained that there wasn't enough funding, they were waiting too long, or they were on a treatment and it got stopped because of lack of funding. Another interesting keyword was the word under, relating to mental health patients. And this was often used in a spatial relationship or metaphor. People would say, I am under Dr. Smith. And that was the only time when that happened with mental health trusts. So people would talk about being looked after by a nurse or seeing a doctor, but they were under a mental health practitioner. And I think there's something interesting about that kind of spatial metaphor in terms of the power relationship that the patient is maybe suggesting there. If you're under somebody, I think you're putting quite a lot of kind of hope in their hands in a way, and you're giving them quite a lot of power. And maybe that's relating to something going wrong, or maybe they're not getting something back, so there's a bigger sense of disappointment when maybe they're not getting made well as quickly as they'd like. In fact, the word worse came up as a key word for this group. Often people reported that they felt worse after seeing a mental health practitioner. And again, I think it was maybe expectations. Mental health issues can take a very long, slow process, And it can sometimes be a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And again, maybe there are so many setbacks in the road to recovery from a mental health issue, and people aren't feeling at their best anyway, that maybe that's one of the reasons why they're giving maybe more negative feedback there. So I think expectations were key, and this is something which kind of emerged after doing different bits of analysis in different ways. It wasn't something which we had as a question initially. And I think it kind of made us realize that maybe the questions that we were being asked or the way we were looking at the data wasn't really that helpful to start with, but only by engaging in those questions could we come up with a different answer, which kind of explained a lot of the data. So I don't think we should view receptionists as necessarily bad. We should view the criticism as a difference in expectations, and also maybe we need to change patient expectations. Maybe we need to say to patients, the receptionist might ask you what's wrong with you. They're not being nosy, it's just so they can help you. Maybe we need to bear in mind that the NHS is overstretched at the moment. There are longer queues, they don't always have the time to answer the phone straight away. They may have somebody who's angry shouting at them in front of them, and then it's your turn, and they're really harassed, and I've seen that happen. It's not necessarily the best job to do. So maybe it's more about criticism of the structure of the NHS and the funding rather than of the personal abilities of the receptionist. And my other bit of advice is that if you go to a doctor's surgery, be nice to the receptionist, even if they're horrible back to you. And it will pay off. I have had that happen. It's not their fault, I think, if they're being rude, and they will appreciate it. Now, I think this does raise interesting, though, ethical questions in terms of changing expectations. So if receptionists, we change expectations, hopefully they will get better feedback. But what about dentists? If we change expectations about dentists, imagine we have a big advertising campaign, dentists are not scary. That was in the past, actually, and we have lots of people saying how great it is. Maybe then people won't give such good feedback to dentists because they will just be expecting it not to be painful. Maybe they'll go to dentists more, and hopefully they will, and we'll all have better teeth, but maybe they won't get the good feedback, and then the NHS won't like that because they click this and they look at change over time. So I think that's a kind of interesting question there. So, lessons learned from this project. Here's my final couple of slides. What will I take forward the next time that I work on a new set of data and collaborate with an external partner? Well, first, I definitely think I would not start with the corpus analysis. I can often be quite impatient. I want to get into the corpus and get a frequency list up straight away and get my keywords up. I think I need to kind of check that and not, and instead engage with the text by reading samples of them from different subcategories to start with, to get a sense of the feel of the data so I can make better interpretations. Sinclair famously said, trust the text. And I agree, let the data drive analysis, but make sure you understand the data. A text is not a list of words taken out of context. It's not a snippet of a concordance line. A text is a text. Once we start to do the corpus analysis stage, be aware that it is reductive, and the tags that we use to categorize may miss important members of a category. They may miscategorize others. Even if you do your own categorization in a kind of bottom-up way, be aware that words are maybe more polysemous than we give them credit for, that they may have semantic posities which can complicate matters, and that words that look like synonyms to start with are probably more different from each other than we may give them credit for. Even at the analysis of cotext, when we start to the concordance line level, I think it's important not to just stick there, but to expand concordance lines as much as possible and carry out close readings, and at least do that for a sample of every concordance that you look at, even if you don't have time to do it for everything. I think if we're just looking at maybe 100 characters of cotext, we can maybe get a sense of a kind of basic positive or negative evaluation, but we don't get a sense of the reasons for that positive or negative evaluations, really. We need to go back out to the text, and we need to keep on doing that, I think, to make sense of our data. I also bear in mind that the best questions are very rarely the first questions that we come up with, and they're never the questions that the people who give you the questions are asking. I wouldn't recommend having no questions at all. I think they are useful as a first stage, but don't have them very specific, and keep an open mind and be looking out for better questions all the way. If you're lucky, they'll be the route to the better questions. And they often come up quite late in the analysis, and they involve identifying maybe similar things that happened in different stages of the analysis, and you have to kind of synthesize those and say there's a pattern which is kind of bigger than the individual bits of the analysis. And I think this is one of those areas which we do at the end, where humans are better at doing this than the computational tools. It's humans who come up with the best questions, humans who make the decisions about what counts as an interesting finding, and humans who make those connections between different bits of analysis. So I'll end by talking about some of the challenges for impact that I've encountered with this project. I think first there's a challenge in convincing non-corpus people that it's an approach which is worth taking. And from experience, I found that sometimes the external partners want to expend as little effort as possible for the most benefit. So they want quick, easy, generalizable solutions. Yet each dataset is different, and often they don't know the right questions to ask of the dataset. Initially, I think often they want to be shown how to do the analysis. So there's often quite a lot of talk at the start of these kind of collaborations where they say, can you train us to do this? And then, then we'll go away and do it. So I kind of say, yeah, I'm happy to do that. And I bring along my tools and my corpus and my computer, and I sit down with them. And then again, there's a kind of eyes rolling back movement after about half an hour where they realize it's not something you can train in an afternoon, as we all know. That's why we're at a summer school. It's hard, getting the data is hard. You have to retrieve it, clean it, tag it, upload it to software. Often it's a case that one piece of software is not going to do everything, so you end up using Sketch Engine for something, and then AntConc for something else, and Wordsmith for something else, and Lancsbox for something else. And on top of that, we have so few standards in our field. If anything, we're proliferating tests and techniques and tools. We have all these different cutoff points and different ways of calculating collocation and keywords. And I think, if anything, there's probably less agreement and certainty now than there was 10 years ago. And I think if you're kind of in the field, that's quite exciting. It's quite cutting edge, and you can write papers agreeing or disagreeing and contributing. If you're a beginner or an outsider, I think it can be quite off-putting and terrifying, in a sense that you have this tool and all these sliders and numbers to type into boxes to do settings, and it's what do I do? What are the best numbers? What's the best way of doing collocation? And I think there's increasingly no agreement over these best ways. So it's perhaps no wonder then that someone would turn to a kind of black box piece of software where you just put something in and you don't have to touch anything or change anything, and out pops the answer at the end with a few nice visualizations. And I think as corpus linguists, we need to bear that in mind, that we're all on the same side. We all want the field to gain recognition. We want the field to do well, and we think it's worthwhile. And I think we all have broadly the same vision and goals. But we need to help each other, I think, and not make things unnecessarily complicated, and maybe not have so many disagreements about the best ways of doing things. I think we also need to bear in mind that the technical language that we use with non-academic partners is not always going to be helpful, and we should use terms that our parents don't understand sparingly, and when we do use them, illustrate them with real-life examples that are interesting. And we need to be careful, I think, about the stories we tell around our research. I think one of the good and bad things about corpus linguistics is it gives us a lot of results, lots and lots of tables and numbers and things that are significant. Too much, really, to do justice to. And I think it's a case of wading through those and trying to find the ones which are actually telling us something that we don't already know and are interesting to outsiders. And these points are often unlikely to be methodological, I think, to outsiders, despite us actually finding the methodology stuff quite interesting as well. In terms of where we communicate our findings, I think for impact, we need to take a multi-pronged approach. There needs to be a mixture of academic and non-academic publication outlets. We need to be better, I think, as a kind of group at switching Register. We study Register a lot. I don't think we're ever so good at changing our Register away from academic to kind of reach the outside. And I've been guilty of that in some of my kind of efforts as well, I think. It requires different ways, I think, of thinking and learning and conceptualizing your research. And it can be a bind to do it, but I think we have to, because if we don't, we fall at the last hurdle. We produce this amazing research, and then only a few people who are our friends read it, and it doesn't really get out there, and it doesn't change anything. So along with our monographs and our journal articles and our conference proceedings and our book chapters, we need also to get on social media. We need to establish an avuncular personality. I don't know if there's a male version of avuncular. Anybody got a suggestion for that? We need to work at producing a few memorable sound bites and learn how to summarize with those infographics as well. And use other formats, things like comedy, for example, or theatre or art, I think, are kind of underexplored ways, I think, of getting some of our messages across, but are worth thinking about. And finally, bear in mind that impact can be down to luck and perseverance. Despite your best efforts, you can't just make it happen. And with other projects, I found it's a very slow and often incremental process. Sometimes it's unmeasurable as well. It can be that it often happens when the project has long finished and you've moved on to other things and you've kind of let it go and forgotten about it, and then you get a phone call from somebody and they're interested and you have to make time of your schedule to kind of go back to it again. So make sure you're ready to make a commitment to a project, not just for the length of the grant or for your PhD, but for much, much longer, many years, even decades. I'm still talking about my PhD, and that was 25 years ago. It also means I think we should relax a little and not place too high an expectation that the day that we publish our research is the day that we're going to change the world. It won't be. Ultimately, we need to focus, I think, on making sure that our research is thorough and clear, and it provides insights that can't be reached by other methods, because that, I think, is what's going to stand the test of time. Thank you.